floor over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. We've got two great panels that we're going to follow, and we have the perfect person, I think, to dig into these topics of industrial policy from a policymaker's perspective, not just to analyze, but also to look back on several years of work in government implementing industrial policy in the sphere of autos and chips and many of the other topics that we've discussed this morning. So it's an absolute delight to welcome Brian to join us today, and thank you for your willingness to not only look forward, but also look back on lessons that you've learned from your time in government, and now having had a year to reflect on what the lessons that you learned in terms of what went well and what could be done better. I thought maybe we could start by picking up on the discussions that we just left off on the automotive industry, which it seems to me brings up some of the dilemmas of industrial policy in terms of having multiple goals one is trying to accomplish at the same time. So in the auto industry, there's a goal of energy transition and transitioning the auto fleet to EVs. There's a security concern about are there espionage risks of having sensors on cars. There are dependency risks when it comes to batteries and certainly to the rare earth magnets that are inside of motors. And all of those were stated goals of the Biden administration to address via a variety of different tools. When you look back, can you first tell us how you thought about prioritizing those different, sometimes compatible, sometimes conflicting goals? And secondly, assess the lessons you drew about the challenges, if there were some, and I suspect there were some, of that prioritization.
Well, thank you for having me. And I would be remiss if we're going to start on the auto industry. I would be remiss to not start by looking back one step farther, in part because Larry just walked into the room to 2009, in my first experience in our first flight of dealing with industrial policy in the automotive industry, so to speak. I was just joking with Mike that Larry and I was a junior person on that team, but we made the Intel deal look sort of pale by comparison, because ended up with a 62% equity stake in General Motors in that context. I think that the reason why I start with that intervention is I look back at that set of interventions, which is become known as the auto bailout of 2009, as largely a success of very aggressive government intervention into the automotive industry with the goal of a broader industrial policy goal in that context. But in a sense, that was the exception, not the rule, because it was during the midst of a crisis, and one of the things we got some things wrong for sure in that context. One of the things we got right was being able to define relatively specifically what the objective was, and we're very clear about things that were not the objective. So we were quite clear and explicit, to the chagrin of a number of people at the time, in saying that there were environmental objectives at play, and the administration was quite committed to those environmental objectives, but we were not going to try to implicate them in any way in the design of the bailout. And there were broader job and place-based economic development objectives at play, and the administration was quite committed to those, and we were not going to implicate those. And that was the subject of some debate and criticism at the time from both sides. But I think one of the features of the success of that intervention was the relative specificity of that. I think if I then flip forward to the Biden experience, I think that there were, you identified multiple objectives. To me, as I think back on it, we had really there were two that were predominant. The first was a environmental objective around trying to put in place a set of regulations and incentives to more rapidly decarbonize the transportation sector. And then the second was a more economic and national security-oriented perspective around how do we secure the upstream supply chains for what has now started to become referred more to as the electrical stack, but we thought about it as the upstream battery and electrical related supply chain, where we saw and identified a growing number of vulnerabilities and wanted to take more proactive actions. Those were the predominant pieces. I think later in the administration, there was more of a concern around connected technologies and the downstream risks associated with those. But those were the primary areas of focus. I think that we did not have a singular crisis moment or a singular tool at our disposal. But I think on both of those, I think we were able to relatively clearly identify what the goals were and then operate, in a constrained political environment, but operate against those goals.
Yesterday in the conversation, Mike Schmidt quoted Ezra Klein on everything bagel liberalism, which I think was first targeted at Mike in its coining. Is that a fair critique as you look back, or is that something that a columnist can say because they don't have responsibility, but in reality, when governing, you've always got to take into account a lot of different constituencies?
Well, I appreciate you pinning all of the blame on Mike. I thought you were about to lob that at me. So look, first of all, I think it's the analogy is a little bit off because the everything bagel is like an extraordinary innovation. And you get a definitively better product with more stuff on it for the same cost. No one charges more for it's kind of extraordinary. So I think the analogy is a little bit off. Look, I think what I would say is the caution is not only appropriate but totally necessary. That the risk associated with the breadth of goals is ever present, and as I think was aptly said at the end of the panel, like all industrial policy is political by nature, right? By design, and so you have to constantly guard against that.
Could I ask you to be specific on that point?
Sure.
What would you have done differently on the everything bagel critique, taken out of the policy mix, for example, to gain that focus?
Well, so what I was going to say is I think it's an appropriate caution. I think that in some places, if I look back, in some places you could apply that caution to places where I think it was fairly applied. In other places, I think they were unfairly. To use your specific example and to come to Mike's defense, there was the amount of criticism, debate, discussion around everything bagel liberalism connected to the childcare provisions of the CHIPS Act was like 2 orders of magnitude out of whack, right? Maybe the sign was in the right direction, but the magnitude was totally off, right? And so that kind of obscured the debate because it was like, well, what does childcare have to do with chips? And it was like, well, what does that have to do with the actual stakes of the policy decisions being made? And so in some ways the critique was used to obscure real areas. That said, I think you look at somebody in the prior panel mentioned the $7,500 electric vehicle tax credit. Like, I think that's a good example of that was some people talk about, in policy making, you have to fall back on your second best policy option because the first best you can't get to in the real world. Like that was an example of like a 17th best policy option that was just imbued with like the confusion of multiple objectives, right? And it was designed between automakers who were literally not looking to try to achieve a policy objective, but try to corner the thing to be maximally attractive to their particular vehicle type. You had particular members of Congress who had particular leverage and had particular designs around what it would mean to do a pro-American thing. You had a jobs imperative, you had a climate imperative, without much regard for how much of the credit was actually for marginal. Like you had a whole bunch of stuff, and then you ended up with a credit that, like, I was sort of like it was like a beautiful mind credit, so complicated, and like it all worked out. And then, it ended up that the administration decided to, basically allow for the credit to be claimed in a much simpler way through the leasing provision. which some people would argue wasn't consistent with the legislative intent, and the legislative intent was like completely confused and messy and all of that. So that's an example where I think like the criticism is fairly applied to say, you know, if we're going to spend taxpayer money on that, prioritize that. You should have you should be able to define more clearly the objective. Now, in the grand scheme of things, we made a set of political judgments around that as a way to get a much larger package of things passed. But that's an example.
Point taken that politics is the art of the possible, and so that's a fair response. One of the dynamics we've been trying to, I think, balance this morning is a recognition that there are places where intervention is necessary, but also you want to keep as much market dynamic as possible to limit the existence of firms that are uncompetitive. In the automotive sector, we have essentially banned Chinese vehicles via very high tariffs and the connected vehicle rule, which makes it almost impossible. Do we have enough competition in our auto markets, given that de facto ban, to produce innovative and low-priced cars?
Look, I think where we are with the auto sector right now, unfortunately, is like a very unfortunate, I referred to it as like a Luddite trap. It's 0 for 2, which is one, we've erected an almost complete barrier to international to foreign competition, which means that our companies aren't subject to the competitive pressure that enables BYD to be so dominant in a place like Mexico City, so close to us. And two, we're somewhere between confusing and undercutting our investments in the technology and the research, development, and deployment of the new technologies that our companies and our industry would need to catch up and go from fast follower to leader. So I think that there is a version of an industrial strategy that says you need to put those types of protections in place in the near term and couple them with targeted incentives toward technological development to help catch up, but with a view toward that catching up toward the global market. I think, unfortunately, where we are today is we both have insufficient competition and insufficient investment in innovation, and those two things together worry me a lot. So that's concerning, and I think it leads to, just to take a point about insufficient competition, and I won't pick on. Well, I will. I'm going to pick on one company, but in particular. But if you go back 3 years ago, right? Just as an example of the lack of competition, right? GM happened upon a extraordinary innovation. They made a small, low-cost electric vehicle. It was called the Chevy Bolt, and it was for like 3 quarters in 2021, 2022, right? It was the fastest selling EV in the country. And it was proving out the idea that you could get share, so you could sacrifice margin for share, and you could try to win a category with a low-cost electric vehicle, right? It was 6 or 8 years behind BYD on that front, and yes, the battery technology is complicated, all of that, but it was winning in the marketplace, right? And then GM went out and announced they were going to discontinue the Bolt, and that's a history of long, a lot of the reasons, I'm not picking just on GM too, the US OEMs that got us into the trouble in 2009 was a consistent view of like wanting to be the second in the market and wanting to trade share for margin as a kind of corporate strategy. And that's not great, right? But I think part of the reason why you see things like that, and again, I'm not picking, there's a lot that goes into that particular decision, and there was a big battery recall, and et cetera, et cetera. But, without being subject to the competition that, that in the global market, the Chevy Bolt is a relatively more expensive vehicle. So, yeah, I think that's a real problem.
So we've discussed this morning other companies that have made decisions that might have been short run rational, but were long run probably irrational. Intel comes to mind with its cuts to R&D relative to what it should have been doing in the 2000s. We've talked about the challenges that Boeing had in the first 2 decades of the century. Should there have been a bigger government effort to pressure a company like GM to take the quote unquote right decision in your view? And I guess I'm envisioning, the current president, as recently as 1 month ago, was tweeting that the CEO of Intel should resign, catalyzing a meeting in the White House. What one could have imagined a hypothetical Biden tweet, perhaps harder to imagine. One could have imagined it. Should we have been taking efforts like that to change the decision-making of private companies?
I mean, I don't think so. I think that the sort of targeted hectoring of individual companies to try to change their corporate decisions is both over the long run. The record on that is relatively poor, and there's a cost associated with doing that. And the more you do that, and the more freely you do that, the cost is around the undermining the basic trust in the market economy that you can operate as a private company and not have to change your strategy because you're being hectored by the government, who could use tools to punish you. So I think that's a distinct question from maybe where you're going around. Should we be more aggressive in using industrial policy tools to try to shape economic outcomes? And in that case, I'm framed that way. My answer is broadly yes, and specifically, but I think that as one of the tools in the toolkit, the kind of I think that the cost of that type of presidential or federal government intervention is significant and hard to see in the moment, but large over across time.
It does seem to me, though, that it's easy to talk about industrial policy tools impacting the market in aggregate, but a lot of the cases we're looking at are cases where there is one firm or two firms that have this outsized influence. And so it's hard analytically to disaggregate in the chip market versus the individual decisions of the TSMC and the Intel CEO and boards of directors, which is, I do think, why you've got the current president on the phone being much more hectoring than perhaps most CEOs would like. But would that not be a justification for more meddling?
Well, so I think you're making an important point, which is that the hardest cases, I think, in this broad industrial strategy space are the spaces where the N of firms who are capable of operating at scale is very low or one, right? I think that's the hardest case, but I don't think it's the dominant case. And so, as an example, if we look at the battery supply chain and even critical minerals, the suite of industrial policy tools that we have is broader, and we could use those more aggressively with less of the acute risks that you have when you end up with the sort of the individual and N of one categories. I think in the N of one, and that's a lot of the reason for the design of the CHIPS program the way it was not because there was an enthusiasm around creating a pot of money where you basically knew you were going to have to allocate it to a very small number of firms, but out of necessity. And I think, objectively, if we look at the impact, the policy tools that are less specifically targeted at one individual firm, or I think have a better track record of success across time as well. So I hear you that when you get to that point and you have that, then you don't have the luxury of saying, well, there's a second Intel. Even in that case, I think that the kind of the public hectoring and the public engagement should be the last case rather than the first. And just to be clear, like there was no Biden tweet on that front, right? But there were a lot of times when, when Joe Biden was on the phone with the CEO of Intel. So it's not as if there was a sort of a quiet disengagement from the stakes associated with the industrial policy. But we made an explicit decision that the cost associated with being out there and doing that in the public mind die. Now, that's debatable. And certainly I think there'd be people on the other side of the debate to say that actually there's utility in doing it in the public way. But I think that the risks and the costs of that outweigh the upside.
Two more questions for me, and then I'd love to turn to the audience as well. One on critical minerals. I think much to your credit, the Biden administration identified critical minerals as a key policy challenge at the very early days of the administration and took a number of steps, especially in the battery supply chain, to bring new supply online outside of China. 4 years later, 5 years later now, assess what worked and what didn't work.
So I think you're right. It was identified as an area of priority. I think that, and as the last panel, talked about, it was identified as an area of priority by the first Trump administration prior to that. And we have a long, history on that front. I think your slide went back to like 2010 or 2011. But I remember, when I first started getting involved in policy, I don't know how many people in this room would have heard of a company called MagnaQuench, but, GM sold MagnaQuench back in 1995 to a Chinese, subsidiary, and that became an issue of, you can trace the technological development way back. I think when I look and say the things that have worked well and will continue to work well, I think the 45X advanced production tax credit. This is basically the advanced manufacturing production tax credit that was in the Inflation Reduction Act that basically said, this is a technology neutral tax credit for the production of a certain set of inputs in the United States, has been a very powerful driver of investment at the margin. We also put the money into the loan guarantee program that is enabling the actions with MP Materials and took initial steps with MP Materials as well. I think that those get the most headline, but in terms of the aggregate investment in the United States in this sector, the most effective tool over the course of the last couple of years has been 45X. So, in terms of like what has worked, the place where if I could go back and I could do more is that one of you admirably tried to do the description of the critical minerals partnership within IPEF, which was an initiative inside of an initiative, which in and of itself was like less than full throttle within the administration. And so we identified the need to basically create a critical minerals buyers club and producers club. We identified the fact that diversifying processing was actually the name of the game, and that mining could flow, and that the diversification of processing could be done across a club of countries, and that you just had to get the right club of countries together, and you had to put the right pressure on them and the right incentives. We identified an issue, spotted all of that. We put trains in motion on all of that. But if you were to say, was that a top? Well, you can ask Jake later today. Ask him in the Q&A. Ask Jake. Like was that a like top 2 national security priority? No. Did it deserve to me? I don't know. It's hard to know. I mean, there was a lot of top 3 national security priorities. But I think that we had the diagnosis right and the basic architecture right. I think we probably should have moved at twice the rate of speed and aggressiveness there. And the last thing I'll say here is two things. One, I think this is a good example of like, one of the principal challenges of doing industrial policy well is you need the continuity of time. You know, everybody says, well, you put things in place and then, factories are built, but the political dividend isn't there. And so then you undermine support for it. Yeah, that's all true. There's no solution to this. There's no solution to many of these problems around, even if you define the objectives in very narrow national security terms, where you can achieve the objective over the course of 2 years or 4 years or even 6 years. So you do need the continuity here. I am hopeful that we see continue to see continuity. We have largely on the critical mineral side seen continuity on that front, and also we're entering into I think the events the last week are entering into a totally new realm, and that that the Chinese actions, be they for negotiating leverage purposes or not, are extraordinary, remarkable. If I think about the analog in the chips context, far beyond anything we would have contemplated doing, or this administration has contemplated doing, even as a bluff or even as a negotiating tactic. And so I think we largely have done the right set of things on the critical minerals. We need to move faster. We need to have a theory that is about diversification across geographies and not about U.S. production. And we need that to be sustained.
Final question. I think there was a theory in parts of the administration, and I don't want to impute this to you unless you'd like to endorse it as well, that there'd be a linkage between industrial policy and domestic politics. You'd do your industrial policy, you'd get battery factories built in swing states, and you'd get more votes in favor of industrial policy in the future. And in some ways, I could see that argument as actually standing up better than one might think, given the election result, insofar as parts of the IRA persisted in ways that you might not have expected if you just listened to the president's speeches. But can you assess that theory and how well it stood up in your mind?
Yeah, I think there were two elements to that theory. One was that a domestic industrial policy was key to our international economic policy and foreign policy, because demonstrating that we had the political will and the willingness to actually invest in building capabilities at home was a sort of key predicate for us to be able to lead on these issues internationally. And I think that stood up very well, including the ways in which we have seen that some of that leadership undermined over the course of the last several months. So as an example, without, the only way we were able to do a critical minerals partnership with other like-minded countries was that we had passed 45X. Not to get wonky about it, but it mattered that we had the capacity to say we're investing domestically in our own capabilities, and we're not just out there hat in hand asking other people to step up. And then second was that that investment in our capabilities would be connected to a political narrative about rebuilding the country and rebuilding the important parts of our country. I think on that part, it's connected temporally. The challenge with that is there's not an immediate political dividend, and we never expected there to be one. Given that, I actually think that the consistent with politics and then policy. One is the IRA and chips and the infrastructure bill. That set of policies is actually less partisan and more politically popular and acceptable than any major domestic legislative accomplishment of any president in the last quarter century. So if you look at every major president and their major domestic accomplishment, Bush and the tax cuts, Trump and his first tax cuts, Obama and the Affordable Care Act, in the first 2 or 4 year cycles, those issues were the primary focus of the political opponents trying to take those down, and were unbelievably unpopular. So the Trump tax cuts, were 2 years in, and then 4 and 6 years out, unbelievably unpopular and underwater politically. The Affordable Care Act was underwater for 8 years, and was the primary tool that Republicans used to try to win back political power until it became popular. And now the politics of that have changed. The combination of those pieces of legislation, when polled from a political perspective, are popular. They're all above water with independents and Democrats. I think the challenge is that they're dispersed and they're diffuse, and so they haven't been a negative. They haven't been the negative that other big domestic policies have been, and consistent with having the shift to Republican majority control of all branches of government. Those policies have fared well in terms of relative continuity. And while the one big beautiful bill tax bill that passed was a historically bad piece of legislation, fiscally, for the social safety net, health wise. On the energy side of it, like, for most of the core components of what we need as a country to actually achieve it, what I would view as the right industrial policy objectives around building out our resilience around what is being called the electrical stack, and a lot of the key climate priorities, most of the story there is one of continuity and not of very significant change. We'll deploy. My prediction that I will make: we will deploy more solar and battery capacity in 2026 than we have any year in the United States in our history, and then we'll do the same again in 2027. And a lot of that is the market, but some meaningful share of that is the continuation of incentives, which neither side on the political side right now has an incentive to say that, right? It's in the Trump White House's political incentive to say they got rid of the Biden's green stuff, and it's in the incentive of Democrats to say Trump got rid of the climate provisions. But in actual fact, that outcome will continue to drive a lot of that investment domestically.
Fantastic. We've got 10 or 15 minutes for questions. We'd love to welcome any from the audience if they have some for Brian, or if not, I've got dozens of questions of my own to pepper you with, but I suspect we've got some from the audience. Please.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Kristen Vicasi, and I was just speaking about rare earths. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you deal with this question of, we have one rare earth player, right? We have MP Materials, one rare earth miner, and this seems like a very difficult national champion situation to cope with because of that one major player problem in the domestic situation. So I'd be curious if you're thinking about that and how you think through that policy. Thank you.
Well, a couple of things on that, right? One is mining versus processing, and what are the actual capabilities that we need, right? And you put that map up, and there are a number of investments in processing that are across the U.S. And if you ask me what's the most important piece of this for us to actually diversify and have more resilience against, it's that. But the second piece of this and I think rare earths really tease this up, is we should be thinking about that diversification objective and that resilience objective from the perspective of a club or a group. And rare earth mining that happens in North America, whether it happens in Canada or Mexico, or that happens in Australia, or that happens in other allied countries, we should be viewing that as the strategic objective should be to try to diversify and then create conditions where we have more reliable, secure supply, and we have the capacity to both produce and procure collectively, right? And that requires, that doesn't on its own answer the question of when you're looking at MP and you're asking what set of policy tools to use, what's the right policy mix, and is it right in that, in context to use a set of tools that will end up with the US having an equity stake, right? You still have to grapple with those questions directly. And in that particular case, I think the justification for the policy tools used that ends up with an equity stake is probably, is certainly more compelling and straightforward than it is in the context of Intel. But if the objective, and this goes to sort of defining of the objective, if the objective is to get to a place where we've got a more diversified, more resilient access to not just the mining, but the processing capabilities, then that, it's a little bit why I was making the point before, that sort of club of nations or club of nations and countries collectively becomes the answer, right?
Please.
Hi, Sarah O'Rourke. I was part of the CHIPS team and now in private industry. Question for you, yesterday Larry challenged Mike and Todd on why we weren't just a tax credit, the CHIPS program. And, we had these $39 billion that we were investing in specific companies. And I think it's something that we grappled with every day existentially. And I know you talked a little bit about where you see the need for, direct funds versus a broad-based tax credit, and also noted that tax credits tend to be, historically simpler to implement and also probably more successful. So I'm curious, how you thought about when that is, the direct funding versus a tax credit is the right tool to be using. And as you look forward to other supply chains, we talked about biotech yesterday. Folks are focused on quantum and getting to scale quantum. Your advice for policymakers on how to think through that differentiation.
Yeah. So I think as a set of general rules and dramatic oversimplifications, right? When it comes to industrial policy, my view on this is that as hard as carrots are better than sticks. And as imperfect as tax credits are better than capped grant programs. And as many flaws as technology neutral applications have, they're better than highly technology specific or firm specific. So as a general rule, right, I think the challenge in the CHIPS context was frankly the magnitude, and I'm telling you this, and this, you guys know this intimately, was that the magnitude of the gap, the cost gap that you needed to fill if you wanted to achieve the objective, right? We could debate the objective of whether, having 30% of leading edge chips in the United States within a decade is a sufficient industrial policy objective for the country to invest in that project. But if you believed in that project, then the cost gap that you had to cover between scaling that production in the US and scaling it and internationally was large enough that it's very difficult procedurally, mechanically to deliver that in a tax credit. You start to hit up the political economy constraints of passing in general, from a tax policy standpoint, you don't want to start passing tax credits that are greater than a 50% tax credit. And in general, we generally don't do more than a 30% tax credit for a bunch of reasons. And that wasn't close to sufficient to covering the gap. So that's a big part of the answer, right? Is we're falling back on second best policy tools.
One final question, please.
Hi, my name is Ketan Ahuja, and I'm a fellow at the Growth Lab here. And I wanted to pick up on something you said about how companies here have a tendency to profit maximize. So GM killed the Bolt because it wasn't profitable, even though it gave it market share. And, we've seen that also with Tesla not releasing a low-cost vehicle, and Boeing made a similar decision to sacrifice share for profits a decade or so ago. And I wonder if that is a structural difficulty in doing industrial policy here, where, other than just the president calling up the CEO of a company to try and push them into commodity parts of the market that enable kind of mass leadership in commodity sectors. And I wonder if there's anything in our toolkit that we can do to help our companies go into those sorts of sectors, the commodity sectors.
Yeah, I worry less about that as like a structural constraint or problem affecting industrial policy. I think that's a caution around the lack of competition or the dynamics of sort of very like late stage industrial companies and how they operate, because for all the companies that we could identify that have made short-sighted decisions to trade share for profit, we could come up with many more who have not made that and have profited by chasing share over margin and then winning, right? So the real problem is if you don't allow that process of the winners to win. And so, from my perspective, if I think about as an example today, the United States, in no small part as a result of the industrial strategy that has been put in place over the course of the last several years, has a number of the leading companies in long duration energy storage, and is, depending on who you want to debate, either at or ahead of China in the long duration innovation, on the edge of innovation around long duration storage, which is a hugely important technology from an economic standpoint, from an energy standpoint, from a national security standpoint. And those companies are doing a lot of that innovative work and research into deployment in the United States, right? And so industrial policy is full of risk, but if our goal is to try to encourage more of that activity here in the United States, the best way to avoid that outcome is to do that in a way that provides stable and predictable incentives to invest in that technology and to scale that technology, but in a way that doesn't that avoids to the maximum degree possible, picking individual champions or stepping in and sort of squashing the competition between those firms. Because the best outcome is that the long duration storage companies have a leg up to do that activity in the United States and then compete vigorously with each other, and some of them will fail, and that's a good thing. And ultimately, we want to encourage that. So I think it's less of a structural problem in the industrial policy and more of it's more of a symptom of these, when you get into the place of the individual, national champion, where that gets really hard.
Well, we've got 1 minute left, so let's take one final question, please.
Absolutely. Bethany Russell, I'm a joint degree student between here and the business school, and I wanted to ask how you thought about the government taking equity stakes as a part of industrial policy, because this is a change we've seen in the new administration. I'm not at all advocating for how they're approaching it, but there is an argument that if taxpayer dollars are being used to fuel industrial policy, then the taxpayer should experience some of the financial upside of these investments and experience a financial ROI in addition to a national security ROI. This is also a way that China approaches its industrial policy through its government guidance funds to enable, more oversight and align incentives. So how did you think about the government taking equity stakes, and when might the government, pursue taking equity stakes as part of industrial policy?
I think you faced or your team faced some pressure from Senator Warren and Senator Sanders on this exact question with regard to the CHIPS Act in particular.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, and I separate they are separable questions between government taking ownership of companies, government directly taking ownership of companies, and then the government having some capacity to share in upside if companies that are the recipients of grants or other government support do really, really well, right? And they swim into the same swim lane, but they're separable. I guess my view on government ownership is that it should be the tool of last resort, not first resort, and that the risks of that because the government is a uniquely has unique power, that the risks associated with government ownership are significant and not necessarily seen in any one individual investment. So my general view is a last resort, not a first. I think you have to grapple with it and contemplate it as a tool on the table. Certainly we did, in the context of 2009 and the auto bailout, I think Larry was my boss at the time and probably asked us at least 7 different ways. Isn't there any other possible alternative? There has to be any other possible alternative other than intervening in a way that resulted in the U.S. having an equity stake, let alone a majority equity stake. And in that case, our judgment was no, but it was only because we had exhausted every other possible option. I think MP is closer to that. Certainly, it's a lot closer to that than Intel, for sure. I think the question of are there other ways of structuring out of the money upside options for the government to try to sort of square that circle of public trust, that government intervention won't always be, heads the company wins and tails the government loses, is a space where, I think that's a space for more creative policymaking and thinking. Todd and Mike and I and Jake and others had this conversation in live form of that there probably was space to do that in different ways in the context of chips, and there were also we had 99 problems, So I think that's, but I think even in that context, you want to come to it with a lot of humility around the costs associated with direct government ownership in this case. And yes, we had a lot of pushback. Now, the last thing I'll say on that, it would be giving us a little bit too much credit to say that we were the barriers at the gate of telling Warren and Sanders that there can't be any equity upside because the goal of that bill was to get a bipartisan majority in which acquiescing to that on their side, that would have gained 2 votes and lost 10, and it was a vote counting exercise. So even if we were motivated to try to get those kinds of provisions in the bill, which we weren't particularly motivated to do, we wouldn't have been able to anyway politically.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much, Brian, for joining us.